Imagine a life where your most exciting moments happen in your mind. That's the world of Walter Mitty, the protagonist of James Turber's short story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Today, we'll break down Mitty's journey, his mundane reality, his heroic fantasy, and what they reveal about him. We begin with Walter Mitty, an ordinary milkman man. He is driving into town with his wife, who constantly nags him. Right away, we see how passive Mitty is and how controlling his wife can be.
Walter Mitty and his wife are driving into town. While she criticizes his driving, he slips into a daydream where he is a fearless Navy commander navigating a storm. His wife nagging interrupts his fantasy, bringing him back to a reality. She leaves him with errands to run while she gets her hair done.
"Not so fast! You are driving too fast," said Mrs. Mitty. "What are you driving so fast for?"
This shows us everything, Mitty's lack of control in his real life. So, how does he cope? He escapes into daydreams. Suddenly, Mitty is no longer just a regular guy. He is a naval commander steering a hydroplane through a raging storm.
"We are going through." The commander's voice was like thin ice breaking. He wore his full dress uniform with the heavily braided white cap pulled down rakishly over one cool grey eye.
This sets the pattern. Whenever life becomes dull or frustrating, Mitty slips into adventure and heroism.
This is the literary devices for exposition.
Characteristic and development of character in exposition. The characteristic is establishing the passive dreamer. Character traits in the beginning is timid and passive as he follows his five commands without argument. The second one is imaginative as he escapes into grand heroic fantasy. The last one of characteristic is socially inept as he struggles to keep up with real life expectations. The character development is when the beginning state, a man trapped in a dual control existence. The fantasy provide is a means to assert the confidence he lacked in real life. Conflict of exposition. The conflict type is man vs self and man vs society. The internal conflict is man vs self. Mitty struggles with his desire to be important and heroic, but in reality he is meek and ordinary. He used daydream to escape from his mundane and control life. External conflict, man vs society. His wife constantly nags him, treating him like a child. Irony of exposition. The irony type is situational irony. Situational irony occurs when expectation contradict reality. Mitty's first fantasy introduced him as a powerful naval commander, confidently leading his crew through a storm.
In exposition, based on real-life settings, there are two types of setting, which is historical and geographical. Historical settings that have been mentioned in the exposition are: the story is set in the late 1930s, a time of rigid social expectations. Men were expected to be competent and assertive, but Mitty is submissive and forgetful, and women had domestic control, which reflected in Mrs. Mitty's dominance over water. Next, geographical settings that have been mentioned in exposition are Waterbury, Connecticut. A small industrial city symbolizes routine and monotony. Mitty is confined to a shopping district, a hotel, and a parking lot, emphasizing his lack of excitement. Meanwhile, based on fantasy settings, there are two types of setting, which is historical and physical settings. Historical settings that has been mentioned are in the 1930s. Aviation was advancing and World War II was approaching. The military commander fantasy reflects Mitty's desire to be a leader in a time of growing global conflict. Next is physical settings. Inside a stormy and naval aircraft, controlling a dangerous mission. The symbolism in exposition in real life is the car. Although Mitty drives the car, but his wife dictates how he drives, showing how little control he has in his real life. In this line, the car represents Mitty's lack of independence. Even though he is behind the wheel, someone else controls him. Meanwhile, in fantasy, the symbolism is leadership and confidence. In his first fantasy, Mitty commands a naval hydroplane in a storm, symbolizing the control he wishes he had in a real life. In fantasy, he is decisive and respected, but in reality, he is passive and ridiculed.
Moving on to the rising action, as Mitty runs errands, real-life events trigger more fantasy, each one more dramatic than the last. First one, when he triggered by passing a hospital.
"If you would take over, Mitty."
In this dream, Mitty is a world-famous surgeon saving life.
Wow!
The second one is where he triggered by hearing a newsboy call about a trial.
Perhaps this will refresh your memory.
He envisioned himself as a skilled marksman on trial accused of a dramatic crime. The last one is when he triggered by reading a war magazine.
We only live once, Sergeant, said Mitty with his faint, fleeting smile. Or do we?
This is when he dreams of being a fearless wartime pilot on a dangerous solo mission.
This is the literary devices for rising action.
Characteristic and development in rising action. Depending escapism and growing frustration. The character traits in rising action is more absorbed in fantasy, where his daydream become increasingly detailed and dramatic. The second one is frustrated with reality, where he resents how others belittle him. The last one is still submissive, where he does not confront those who mock or dismiss him. The character development in midway state is his daydream intensify as reality become more frustrating. Fantasies provide a contrast to his real-life humiliation, but do not change his real behavior. Conflict of rising action. The conflict type is man vs self and man vs society. The internal conflict is man vs self. Mitty struggle between his heroic fantasy and his dull reality. His forgetfulness makes him feel incompetent following his desire to escape. The external conflict is man vs society. People around him treat him impotent and disrespect, reinforcing his low self-esteem. Fantasy conflict. In his surgeon fantasy, he is a brilliant doctor far superior to the real-life Walter Mitty, who struggle with sympathies. In his courtroom fantasy, he defends himself expertly, unlike in reality, where he is constantly corrected. Irony of rising action. The irony type is situational and dramatic irony. The situational irony where Mitty's real-world failure contrasts with his imagined success. Example from his fantasy. In his doctor fantasy, he is world-class surgeon serving life. But in reality, Mitty struggles with his sympathies like parking his car or remembering errands. For dramatic irony, the reader understands that Mitty is lost in his fantasy, but the other characters do not. The example, a woman passing by laughed at him for saying puppy biscuit out loud. The irony is the reader knows Mitty was deep in thought, but to outsider he seemed absurd and foolish.
In rising action, the real life has two settings, which is historical and geographical settings. The historical settings are the Great Depression created a society focused on practicality and responsibility. Mitty's errand running life contrasts with his dream of heroism. Next is geographical settings, which is water-based commercial area filled with stores, a hospital, and a parking lot. This significance as the shopping errands reflect his domesticated and unremarkable life. Meanwhile, in the fantasy, there are two settings, which is historical and physical settings. Historical settings that has been mentioned is the 1930s saw major medical advancements and surgeons were admired figures. Mitty imagined himself as a brilliant doctor in contrast to his lack of power in reality. Next is physical settings, which is an advanced operating room with complex machinery. In fantasy, he is an expert saving lives, while in reality, he struggles to park his car properly. The symbolism in rising action in real life overshoes and gloves. When Mrs. Mitty constantly reminds him to wear gloves and buy overshoes, symbolizing his lack of control over his own choices and his declining masculinity. The gloves and overshoes represent his wife's control and society's expectation of aging men. The second symbolism in real life is the parking attendant. Mitty is humiliated when a parking attendant takes over for him, reinforcing his low status in society. That the parking attendant symbolizes how others treat Mitty as weak and incapable. Meanwhile, in fantasy, in his surgeon fantasy, Mitty is highly skilled, respected, and admired, contrasting with the helplessness he feels in reality. This symbolizes that the operating room represents his desire to be needed, competent, and admired, a direct contrast to being a forgetful, ridiculous husband in real life. The second symbolism in fantasy is the courtroom. Mitty imagines himself as a brilliant defendant, turning the tables on authority figures. The courtroom represents his desire to be in control and admired, unlike reality where he is constantly belittled.
So, now, moving on to the climax, Mitty fantasy reached their peak in the final, most dramatic daydream. He imagined himself standing before a firing squad, a moment of ultimate bravery.
To hell with the handkerchief, said Walker Mitty scornfully. He took one last drag on his cigarette and snapped it away. Then,
Here, Mitty sees himself as undefeated even in the face of death.
This is the literary devices for climax.
Characteristic and development of climax is a shift in his mental state, character traits in the climax. The first one is becoming detached from reality when he is so deep in fantasies that real life fades away. The second one is passive by defense, where his final fantasy is less about action, more about standing strong. The last one is more resigned in reality, where he does not even react when his wife interrupts him. The character development is when near climax state, where Mitty is no longer just escaping, but he is withdrawing from real life. The last one is fantasies provide, is a place to accept his fate with dignity rather than change his reality. Conflict of rising action. The conflict type is man vs self and man vs society. The internal conflict is man vs self. Mitty struggle between his heroic fantasy and his dull reality. His forgetfulness makes him feel incompetent following his desire to escape. The external conflict is man vs society. People around him treat him impotent and disrespect, reinforcing his low self-esteem. Fantasy conflict. In his surgeon fantasy, he is a brilliant doctor far superior to the real-life Walter Mitty, who struggle with sympathies. In his courtroom fantasy, he defends himself expertly, unlike in reality, where he is constantly corrected. Irony of climax. The irony type is situational and verbal irony. For situational irony, in his firing squad fantasy, Mitty faced death with courage and dignity. The irony is, in reality, he is afraid to stand up for himself against his wife and society. Verbal irony, Mitty calls himself Walter Mitty the undefeated. The irony is he is not undefeated at all, he is constantly overruled in real life.
In climax, the setting that has been mentioned in real life is historical, which is by the 1930s, urban areas were growing and social routines revolve around shopping and errands. Mitty's mundane tasks reinforce his insignificance. The second setting that has been mentioned is geographical. The cold and rainy weather reflect his isolation and emotional detachment. That the cold, lifeless setting mirrors Mitty's growing detachment from reality. Meanwhile, in fantasy, the settings that has been mentioned is historical, which is executions by firing squad were common during the World War I and pre-World War II political conflicts. Mitty imagines himself as a fearless hero meeting his fate with dignity. The next setting is physical, which is a bleak execution ground surrounded by soldiers. In fantasy, he accepts death with courage, while in reality, he is just waiting for his wife outside a store. The symbolism in climax in real life is the rain. As Mitty stands alone in the cold rain, it symbolizes his loneliness and fading connection to reality. The rain reflects his growing detachment and emotional numbness. Meanwhile, the symbolism in climax in fantasy is the firing squad. In his final fantasy, Mitty imagines himself facing a firing squad, standing strong and undefeated. The firing squad represents his ultimate escape from reality. Instead of fighting back in real life, he chooses defiance in fantasy, symbolizing either victory or surrender.
So now for the following action, Mitty's wife interrupts his thoughts again, bringing him back to reality.
I've been looking all over this hotel for you, said Mrs. Mitty. Why do you have to hide in this old chair?
She dismisses his thoughts, reinforcing his powerless position in real life.
This is the literary devices for falling action.
Characteristic and development of falling action. A man on the edge of reality, character traits in falling action. The first one is no longer fighting reality, where he barely responds to his wife's instruction. The second one is fully absorbed in thought, where he does not even try to correct her perception of him. The last one is emotionally numb, where he shows no distress at his treatment. Conflict of falling action. The conflict type is man vs self and man vs society. The internal conflict is Mitty is mentally withdrawing from reality, with his fantasies have taken over. The external conflict is continue, where his wife continue to nag him, showing that nothing has changed in the real world. Irony of falling action. The irony type is dramatic irony. The reader knows Mitty is mentally escaping into his daydream, but his wife does not realize how distant he has become.
In falling action, the settings that have been mentioned in real life are historical settings, which is a man standing outside a store waiting for his wife, reflects traditional gender roles of the time. Next is geographical settings that has been mentioned are still in Waterbury's commercial district, but Mitty is mentally drifting away. His real-world isolation sets up his final retreat into fantasy. The symbolism in falling action in real life is Mrs. Mitty's absence. As Mrs. Mitty leaves him alone outside the drugstore, Mitty is finally free from her direct control, yet he still chooses to escape into his imagination. Her absence represents a small moment of independence, yet Mitty does nothing with it. He immediately retreats into another fantasy.
The last one is the resolution. The story ends with Mitty lost in thought, standing in the rain. He is once again a hero in his mind, facing the firing squad.
Walter Mitty, the undefeated, inscrutable to the last.
But what does this mean? Is he surrendering to his dull life, or this is final act of defiance, choosing to be a hero in his imagination rather than a nobody in reality?
This is the literary devices for resolution.
The characteristic and development of resolution. The final escape. The character traits in resolution. The first one is fully withdrawn into fantasy, where his last fantasy suggests he has mentally left reality. The second one is still powerless in real life, where he does nothing to change his situation. The last one is ambitious defense, where he faced the firing squad proudly. But is this a victory or surrender? The character development, where final state, Mitty is no longer just escaping reality, he has fully retreated into it. Fantasies provide not just escape, but his only real sense of identify. Conflict of resolution. The conflict type is man vs self, where final surrender happens. The internal conflict is man vs self, where it resolves in fantasy. Instead of fighting for control in real life, Mitty fully embraced his daydream, choosing to see himself as heroic in his mind. Irony of resolution. The irony type is situational and dramatic irony. For situational irony, fantasy ending where Mitty faced the firing squad fearlessly. The reality ending, he is just standing in the rain waiting for his wife. The irony is the word undefeated is ironic. In reality, Mitty has lost all control, but he sees himself as victorious. For dramatic irony, the reader understands that Mitty is escaping into fantasy permanently, but his wife remains oblivious. The symbolic of firing squad, the death in his daydream, could symbolize the death of his real self. As he finally gives up on reality, the reader realizes that depth of Mitty detachment, but the world around him does not notice or care.
In resolution, the settings that have been mentioned in fantasy are historical and physical settings. The historical context in his Mitty's last fantasy may reflect real wartime executions, symbolizing his final detachment from reality. Next, the physical context is he remains physically in the rain, but mentally he is in his last fantasy. This line is contrast with reality, which his fantasy world has completely overtaken his real life. The symbolism in resolution in real life is the firing squad. Mitty remains mentally absent, completely detached from his dull reality. Next, the symbolism in resolution in fantasy is the firing squad, symbolizes his final surrender or ultimate defiance. The firing squad fantasy could symbolize either a noble escape or choosing fantasy over reality, or a metaphorical death, which is his complete withdrawal from life. Here is the plot structure and the literary devices of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. That's all from us. Thank you!